I'm really excited that we could do this tonight, Bill. Our speaker tonight is William Smith, and William is a longtime student of Claes Ryn on our board. And this book he's written on democracy and imperialism is really quite interesting, quite provocative. I think everyone will benefit from it. I might start by saying, when I went to Harvard, I never heard of Irving Babbitt, and no one ever talked about him. And I was really quite embarrassed that it took Claes Ryn, a professor at Catholic University, to tell me about this giant of a professor at the turn of the century, last century. Bill will go into all that. Bill went to Georgetown as an undergraduate, and had Gene Kilpatrick as his professor, who inspired him in political philosophy. And he then pole vaulted over to Claes at Catholic U, because Claes had started a political philosophy, the political science department there. That was really quite extraordinary. And he has many students to his testimony to that. And Bill was one of his best. And Bill then got interested in, did a stint on the Hill. He actually worked in our Article 1 branch. And then he went into business, went in the pharmaceutical industry, where he was with, Bill, was it Pfizer or Merck?
Pfizer, yes, sir.
Pfizer for over a dozen years. And so now he's back at Claes's think tank at Catholic. And the title of that is, what is it called?
Center for the Study of Statesmanship.
Center for the Study of Statesmanship. So with any further ado, let's just jump into this, Bill. And since we're on Zoom, we may, Bruce or Claes or myself or anyone can just jump in, raise your hand, and we can. But we'll have a brief statement, and then we'll get into our discussion as quickly as we can.
Yes, thank you, John. And please, people, jump in. I don't want to just drone on here for 15 minutes or so and not have people ask for clarification or ask a question. First, let me thank John and the committee for inviting me. I was telling John earlier today that it's a little bit like being invited by Mark Twain to talk about the Spanish-American War, in the Anti-Imperialist League. So I'm very honored. But I want to start by asking sort of an uncomfortable question. So what if the imperialism in the United States, starting in the Spanish-American War, accelerating in the post-Cold War world, what if that is not simply an error of judgment and policy error? What if it's not kind of just an ignorance of the requirements of the Constitution? What if it's a cultural problem? What if it's a deeper issue where politicians and leaders are willfully ignoring what the requirements are? Is it a cultural issue, not just a legal, constitutional, and policy issue? That's sort of the question I want to start at. And let me start with an analogy before we talk about foreign policy. And the analogy might be the First Amendment. So the First Amendment, of course, ensures all sorts of legal protections for free speech. But anybody who's dealt with an ideologue in discussion knows that there are people that aren't quite interested in free speech. They don't operate from the position of rationality. They use all sorts of tricks, name calling, verbosity, appeals to authority, all sorts of tricks that demonstrate that they're really not interested in debating. And when you meet people like that, you realize that yes, the First Amendment is very, very important. But you also have to have a culture of rationality. You have to have leaders with a certain temperament who are willing to discuss and engage in a back and forth and change their opinion based on new information. It's the entire temperament and entire culture that's required for the First Amendment to be valuable. And I want to, that analogy, I think, has some parallels with the problems we're running into with War and Peace and the Constitution. Our neoconservative friends may be quite familiar with the strictures of the Constitution, the war powers, all the limitations about going to war. but they may not just be culturally interested in complying with them. They may have a character and a personality that's not suited to a constitutional republic. And that is a harder problem. So therefore, I kind of want to reach the controversial conclusion that our problems in War and Peace with the Constitution are not simply due to a lack of fidelity to the Constitution. They're a character trait. Imperialism is a character trait in our leaders. It's a psychology, it's a culture. And our leadership, many of our leadership, particularly in the national security community, have what I would call an imperialistic personality. They look out at the world and they have a will to power and they say, I'm better than those other nations. I deserve to control them. I deserve to rule them. That takes a certain constitution, a personal constitution, to make those sorts of claims that goes beyond just the Constitution. So let me get into this and why I reached this conclusion. I've written a book on, as John said, on Irving Babbitt, who was a professor of French literature at Harvard. He probably founded the discipline of comparative literature. He taught from the late 19th century up until the day he died in 1933. Like our own Chas Freeman, he was a whiz at languages. He was well-versed in the Romance languages. He could read and speak classical Greek and Latin. He also had mastered Sanskrit and Pali, and therefore had developed a strong interest, if not a love, for Eastern religions. So Babbitt didn't set out to write about foreign policy. He was a literature professor, and he particularly had a particular interest in French Romanticism. But he began to notice, particularly in his studies of the French Revolution, that there were tendencies in the French Revolution that were very different from that of the American Revolution. You know, unlike the events in the 18th century colonies in the United States, the French had a brutal reign of terror, a terror that's been downplayed by many French historians who are sympathetic to the revolution, but it was immensely brutal terror. And that kind of thing never emerged in the American colonies. And another thing that emerged from the French Revolution was foreign policy imperialism, first in the form of the wars of the French Revolution and later in Napoleon himself, who wasn't a rejection of the revolution. Napoleon himself said, I am the culmination of the revolution. So the revolution ended with an orgy of war and foreign policy imperialism. And as a side for this group, I want to point out that you know, in the French Revolution, the Committee on Public Safety, which really is the group that launched the terror, was not simply created to crush domestic opposition. It was a creation of the French national security state. The French had lost some major battles at Neerwieden and Louvain recently, and they thought that this was due to lack of domestic support. So they set up the Committee on Public Safety as kind of an NSA, to engage in domestic surveillance and crush political opponents who might be undermining their imperialist foreign policy. So, you know, it's going back to the French Revolution. I think this group will resonate with this group. That's the suppression of civil liberties at home and international imperialism are really fruits from the same tree, as we saw in the French Revolution. So and also, besides his study of the French Revolution, Babbitt grappled with international affairs because he was teaching in the lead up to the Great War. And Babbitt saw in the kind of evangelization of foreign policy by Woodrow Wilson, the Make the World Safe for Democracy, he saw many of the same traits that were exhibited by the French Jacobins. As we know from the scholarship of my mentor, Claes Ryn, there's a clear line of commonalities running from the French Jacobins through Wilsonian internationalism and right up directly to modern neoconservatives. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those underlying orientations are and help diagnose what imperialism, where it comes from. So Babbitt took an ecumenical approach to human nature. He was a fan of Aristotle, and he pointed out that Aristotle, quote, recognizes that man is a creature of two laws. He has an ordinary self of impulse and desire, but if a man is to become human, he must not let impulse and desire run wild. He must oppose to everything excessive in his ordinary self the law of measure. And this is, of course, very similar to St. Paul, who believed that that sin pressed upon the human being, and that there was a conflict between the law of the flesh and the law of the spirit, and the law of spirit had to overcome. So in the West, there's the traditional understanding that there's an interior struggle within human beings to master the lower parts of their nature. But Babbitt goes beyond that because of his study of Eastern languages, and he points to Buddha, for example, who says the man who conquers himself is the greatest of conquerors. He points to the Hindu text. There's a famous phrase in Hindu text called the inner check. You must check your desires if you want to become a virtuous person. And I love this quote from Confucius, who says, "That wherein the superior man cannot be equaled is simply this, his work which other men cannot see." So Babbitt called this internal struggle of human beings the wisdom of the ages. Human beings have two personalities, a lower inclination of selfishness, avarice, pride, and importantly for imperialism, a will to power, versus a higher potentiality of selflessness, humility, decency, self-discipline. Human beings are cleft between these two things. And Babbitt strongly argued that the framers of the American Constitution were wholly in agreement with this traditional view of human nature. The Constitution, of course, is not a work of philosophy, but its underlying assumptions are that human beings are cleft between a higher and a lower nature. Babbitt called, Hamilton, for example, called the lower nature of human beings temporary delusions that must be overcome by more cool and sedate reflections. And Madison famously said that men are not angels, and therefore there's a necessity of auxiliary precautions. So human beings have a lower nature that need to be checked both by the individuals themselves and by very cleverly designed Republican institutions. Those two things, human beings themselves, making themselves working hard to be more virtuous, and then Republican institutions that are going to check selfishness and arbitrary power. So because all human beings have these lower potentialities, the will of the people, the popular will, likewise, can be selfish or malevolent, or it can be measured, restrained, and deliberate. So to make sure that the popular will prevails, all things must be arranged so that the selfish and impulsive popular will cannot exert itself unfiltered. The lower the will of the people cannot be permitted to rule. It must be checked, refined, elevated until the people's true interests prevail. So this is, I'm conflating the mechanics of the Constitution with human nature, but I think the mechanics of the Constitution are premised on the understanding that human nature is divided between these two potentialities, and therefore we have to put in these safeguards to make sure the lower potentialities don't dominate. And as the Hindu phrase put it, the Constitution is the people's inner check against their own arbitrariness or self-dealing. So because they had a skeptical view of human nature, that the framers of the Constitution valued two things most. Leaders with a Republican personality, I will call it. Leaders who are willing to compromise, willing to thwart and not inflame the irregular passions, what Madison called the irregular passions of the people. So you need sort of aristocratic leadership. And because such leaders of strong character can't be assured, the Constitution provided auxiliary precautions that would allow the cool and deliberative sense of the community to prevail. I sometimes worry that because the United States has a very robust legal culture that concentrates on the mechanics of the Constitution, there's a forgetfulness that the framers were pretty clear that republics require leaders of a certain character. Without leaders who possess this culture of Republican values, the Constitution can just become parchment. If you have evil people as leaders who are willing to, for example, kill their political opponents, the Constitution is not going to protect you very much. So I would say the Constitution is not simply threatened by the people avoiding the legal requirements, but also by an imperialistic culture that has no desire to be restrained by anyone or anything. So Babbitt also goes on and points out that in the 18th century, a kind of democracy was given birth to that was very different from the framers of the Constitution. And that democracy, the second type of democracy, Babbitt laid at the doorstep of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French Romantic. And Rousseau rejected the notion that the human personality is divided between higher and lower desires. He felt human beings were naturally good. In Rousseau's State of Nature, the famous noble savage was not desirous of private property, was not prideful or envious of others. He merely wished to lounge around under a shade tree, find his next meal in the forest, never hoarding food, never acquiring property. Noble savages had no concept of right or wrong because they operated from instinct. They were like those in the animal kingdom. The conscience was an idea that was artificial to the noble savage. Conscience for Rousseau needed to be ignored, not cultivated. So with this view of human nature, a democratic theory for Rousseau emerged. Human beings possess no lower nature. Their instincts are naturally good. There's no need to take the auxiliary precautions recommended by Madison. No need to set up elaborate checks on the popular will. No, precisely the opposite. The trick is to restore human beings to that natural aboriginal condition and then let the popular will prevail uninhibited. So Rousseau is the political philosopher who endowed public opinion polls with the kind of metaphysical meaning that they secretly embody the true will of the people, the poll. And he's the inspiration for some of our, in the contemporary legal culture, who believe that Supreme Court justices need to decide cases based on popular preferences, on laws and precedents and congressional laws. So Rousseau, however, looked around and he saw that there's complex civilization now. People have private property. There are monarchies, there are aristocrats. The noble savage isn't anywhere to be found. So he believed that the noble savage had been corrupted by private property and other decadent institutions, and to achieve a pure democracy, to ensure a rule by the truly good people, these corrupted institutions need to be destroyed. So under Rousseau's influence, the French Revolution put targets on the back of the wealthy, the aristocracy, the clergy, the royalty. The true people's will could not emerge for Rousseau when these parasites disturb the natural equality of human beings. And so on the domestic front, Rousseau's democratic theory is a justification for revolution. You see people on the streets now who want to tear down every institution. You think, why are they doing this? And if they're good Rousseauists, they believe that tearing down these institutions will allow the naturally good common people to emerge as rulers. So you have in Rousseau a democracy that's the polar opposite of the framers. Human beings and popular sentiments are not cleft between higher and lower potentialities. Human beings are naturally good. Everywhere they desire to be free, but everywhere they're in chains because of civilization. There must be a revolution to destroy those institutions and unleash the unchecked popular will. So you have two opposing views of democracy, two opposing views of leadership. Notice that because of the assumptions, the philosophical assumptions of the different forms of democracy, leadership takes a different tact. For the framers, of course, leaders had to reflect a certain quality of character that permitted cordial relations with opponents and that could steer and influence public opinion to the best course of action. A republic requires leaders with a republican temperament. For Rousseau's leaders, democracies do not serve any ethical function. They're simply midwives for public opinion. They are servants of the people. The ideal member of Congress for Rousseau would be one who polled his constituents regularly and simply voted their preferences in every case. And we know which type of leader generally populates Washington, D.C. So let me close by talking a little bit about foreign policy and the implications. So what are the qualities that the framers desired in Republican statesmen, and how would they approach foreign policy? Well, the same qualities of magnanimity and goodwill that leaders should display in domestic politics are those they should display abroad. A republic requires leaders of humility and compromise who don't let their emotions and desires run wild. And thanks, of course, to Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, we know exactly how a Republican statesman should approach foreign policy. In his farewell address, written by Hamilton largely, the great Washington recommended that Republican statesmen should, quote, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all, and that, quote, permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded. The nation that indulges toward another a habitual hatred or habitual fondness is to some degree a slave. And finally, right out of today's headlines, a true republic should avoid the necessity of an overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty. So that's the Republican view of what foreign policy should be, small r Republican. So what is the foreign policy disposition of Rousseau? Well, it's one that lacks humility. It's boastful, it's hectoring. It is one that claims that democratic nations are inherently superior model to all the other nations. As Mike Pompeo said recently to the audience at the Claremont Institute, quote, "America is a place and history apart from normal human experience." America is so special, so exceptional, it's outside of history, outside of history. So let's quote from some of the Jacobins who launched the Wars of the French Revolution, and you hear the unmistakable language of Mike Pompeo and other neoconservatives. This is a quote from a prominent Jacobin in the French Assembly. "The French are the foremost people of the universe, so their conduct must respond to their new destiny. As slaves, they were bold and great. Are they to be timid and feeble now that they are free? All nations with a monarch for these Jacobins were declared illegitimate with a stroke." The Jacobin viewpoint is the neocon viewpoint and an invitation to total war. And that's just what the Jacobins got. So let me end by emphasizing that we require a robust policy debate to point out the devastation that American foreign policy has caused. We require a great constitutional literacy. The Americans are terribly constitutionally illiterate, and the committee has done unbelievable yeoman's work in constitutional literacy. But we also must require a return to the Republican personality in our leaders and a purging of the imperialistic personality. And accomplishing this is a long-term and very difficult task. It means changing the culture. It means raising and educating children to be moderate and sensible and decent. It means having robust religious institutions who remind us that we're all sinners and give us humility. It means a restoration of the federal system where individuals live locally and feel genuine responsibility to the actual neighbors who live down the street. And the kindnesses we perform in our everyday life translates into politics that is not boastful or arrogant. It requires that America and its leaders engage in ethical work that others cannot see, and we become a better people. So thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. That was very stimulating, and I'm sure that'll stimulate a lot of conversation. I see, Bruce, you're on, you muted yourself there. Bruce, can you unmute yourself, or Max? So basically, I think, Bill, you've made a, Babbitt was really quite a creative guy and broke a lot of new ground, and had embraced the constitutional personality and citizen identity of the founding generation, and that's what the committee seeks to restore. But let's talk a little about the struggle of the higher and lower self. So the general theory of man that says basically we're crooked timber. We've got a higher self, the better angels of our nature, and then we have a lower self, the drive for power, the drive for money, the drive for sex, the drive for fame, the thirst for certainty. The five horsemen of the lower self, it's not really a fair fight with the better angels. So we need a lot of help. And so Madison, created separation of powers. People say that that the idea came from many sources, but the Madison is really the guy that thought out separation of powers, and it grew from his general theory of man, which you've articulated so clearly here. So if we need, if we have ambition to check ambition, isn't that pitting the lower self against the lower self? Where does the separation of powers isn't based on a belief in that we're going to mortgage our destiny to the episodic expression of the higher self?
There's no doubt. And then I do believe the separation of powers is pitting the lower self against the lower self, as pitting faction against faction is pitting the lower self against the lower self. But what emerges under the constitutional order is something a little superior, right? I mean, the conclusion of the pitting of the lower self against the lower self is some kind of compromise that protects the interests of both. And that it can be defined as achieving the higher self, if you see what I mean. So
not literally in the individual, but as a the societal
correct.
result. Yeah,
Exactly.
so it's an institutional. Bruce, I see you have your hand up. Why don't you?
Yeah. I want to amplify, if I can, Bill, on John's statement, and that is, I think you are emphasizing the importance of individuals with high character that would lead and inspire others to leap out of their lower self. But I think what Madison understood was that's largely a futile exercise. Since the beginning of time, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, as Thucydides wrote in the Peloponnesian War. It's not unique to the United States for the species to have an imperialistic tendency. The armored knight is across the pages of poetry and romance in all ages and all civilizations. And what I think Madison saw was that you could rearrange the lower self in ways that would check destructive impulses without needing some paragon of virtue to inspire the people to act virtuously. Remember, in his description of why the Constitution entrusted the war power exclusively to the Congress, he says that war is the nurse of executive aggrandizement. And he goes through and explains why all the traits of the executive personality, the lust for power and fame, leaving footsteps in the sands of time, would cause the executive to invent excuses of war to go to war. When he proposes his Bill of Rights, he defends it and says the institution of the judiciary can be trusted to check the other two branches of government because of their institutional incentives, not because they would be populated necessarily by high and virtuous people. And that, I think, is what John referenced in saying, and I think you yourself, ambition against ambition. I think you're absolutely right. The result is what we would hope we could get with a putative, virtuous person, but we're not relying upon that for success. And I think the reason why the United States imperial personality has now broken from the framing is because we no longer comply, or even make a pretense of complying with separation of powers. In 230 years, in only 5 conflicts did Congress ever vote to go to war, and only in cases where we thought for true or other reasons we had been attacked. Presidents go to war at the drop of a hat. And I think that's a different, approach to trying to solve our imperialist overreach than trying, it's complementary. I'm not saying it's not good to cultivate virtue, but it seems to me a very unreliable bulwark to think that we would restrain our imperialist tendencies, because most of them don't exist. And if they do, they hate politics.
Yes, Bruce, I understand. And I'm not promoting a theory, a great man theory, where we have to have all these noble people wandering around, and those are going to be the people that save the republic. That's really not my position. My position is there needs to be, first of all, a baseline level of virtue for the Constitution to operate. For example, if members of Congress are willing to murder members of the Supreme Court, then all the separation of powers in the world are not going to protect the constitutional order. So there has to be sort of a baseline of civilizational or orderliness among people, among leaders in a constitutional republic. And you know, I'm a great admirer of Madison. I'm not trying to say Madison did not get it. I'm just worried that when we have people in Congress, for example, who willfully ignore the constitutional requirements for the war powers, for example, you have a problem of character. You have a problem of, and again, I'm not holding out that all these people should be Jesus. I'm saying that there's a baseline of support for the constitutional order that's required, a Republican personality that's required, that is being ignored by members of Congress right now. And that's a personal decision on their part. It's a personal failing on their part.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. But remember, is that different from the occupant of the White House saying, and then I have Article 2, where I can do anything I want as president?
No, it isn't different. No, I mean, I think the constitutional order is breaking down, both because people aren't abiding by the rules of the Constitution, but also because you have personality types who are willing to ignore it.
So Bill, I think we have fingerprints at the crime scene here. This is not as abstract as we're discussing. I mean, the two political parties, the committee's kind of unusual in the sense that we're trying to get conservatives and liberals together and independents work on a constitutional personality, citizen identity, and try to talk about the things that the two parties won't talk about. So the competition's working between the parties on healthcare. It's working on the environment. They compete on immigration, on social issues. But when it comes to the money and the violence, largest empire in history, too big to fail banks, the warfare state, the bailout state are off the table. And Israel and the surveillance state are subsidiaries of the warfare state. So what we do is we talk about what the two political parties won't talk about. And in that sense, we don't have any competition. But so I think we know how we got here, don't we? I mean, basically, starting with you going back to Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the two political parties have spent the last 100 years, brick by brick, dismantling the Constitution and destroying separation of powers. And so now we're in a situation where we have a separation of parties rather than separation of powers. We've got every 2 years, 4 years, we're told that this is the most important election of our lifetime. We're told, both parties tell us the same thing. They say that the other side wins, we're going to lose the country. And the reality is that we have lost our constitutional, and the republic is dead. And who killed it? The two political parties. So I don't think we have to go very far to, in terms of where the fingerprints are. So why do you like to describe this in such abstract terms? Are you uncomfortable laying the equal responsibility or primary responsibility to the two political parties?
No, I agree with everything you said, and I think we have a very difficult Madisonian problem in the sense that we now have a faction, a very powerful faction. It's $1 trillion faction if you consider the defense budget, the intelligence budgets, and the law enforcement budgets. We have $1 trillion faction whose interests are aligned in one direction. That's a very difficult thing to, I'm not naive in saying that, well, statesmen of virtue can overcome this faction. But I think the larger point I would make related to my talk is that there were earlier statesmen who had more freedom of action. There was McKinley, there was Wilson. There were people that were in a position where the military-industrial complex had not become so powerful. And Wilson, for example, made deliberate decisions to squash civil liberties, to go into World War I, despite his campaign promises against it. He had more freedom of action back then because, as you point out, the parties had not developed into war parties in both situations. So my point is only that, at some point we really needed statesmen to make individual decisions saying, I'm not going to go there, to have a Republican personality and not an imperialistic personality. And unfortunately, what McKinley converted to, what TR was, what Wilson became, were imperialistic personalities. And that's helped build up the institutional problems we have now. And I admit these are real problems, to have both parties as war parties, to have everyone on the Armed Services Committee united in one direction and no one complaining about it. I don't downplay that at all, and I'm not naive about the ability to turn that around. But my only point is that earlier in our history, there were statesmen who could have made different decisions, and instead they led us in a different path.
Yeah, if I could ask you this, Bill, I mean, it seems to me that when you actually interact with Congress like I do, it's really, for the reasons you've explained, it's hopeless. They will tell you, we don't want to vote on these issues. It'll give our primary opponent an opportunity, and it's Democrat and Republican alike. Don't come up here. I remember I once had a debate with John Yoo, the National Defense University. He was describing going up, because the executive branch, of course, drafts all the war resolutions. And he said that the members were angry that they were even asking Congress to consider voting on it. So here, your characterization of the need for at least a minimal threshold of constitutional literacy or decency, we're way below that.
Yep.
Congress doesn't want to vote on the war issue. They will do nothing. They'll write a letter, this or that. But how do you change that? How do you force somebody to vote? Says, we all unanimously agree, let's never vote. Pelosi and McConnell vote.
It is a terrible, terrible situation. And I'm not naive about being able to turn it around by some, by statesmen suddenly turning to virtue and character building. I'm not naive about that. But it shows how far things have broken down when these members of Congress do not care what the Constitution says. They don't want to protect their prerogatives of their branch of government, as Madison thought they would. They're willing to throw that all away so that they can campaign at home and get reelected. There's a certain character type. There's a certain personality that is embodied in that, and that's problematic. I mean, Madison would be horrified that we don't even have a baseline of virtue among members of Congress.
I see Claes. I was going to say, go ahead, Claes. Jump in here. See, you have
Well,
your hand.
John, you surmised that we know pretty well how we got here. I'm not so sure that most people, certainly not most Americans, know how we got here. We have great difficulty, I think, putting ourselves in the shoes of the people who wrote the Constitution. Who were they? Were they anything like today's Americans? What were their backgrounds? What did they think about? What did they assume? Now, Bill and you yourself, John, have always stressed that they believe that there's a dark side to human nature. The Christians talk in terms of original sin. There's some sort of perversity that makes people want to lord it over others, etc., etc. They assume, the framers assume, that that's human nature. And that's why we have to have mighty sturdy constitutional restrictions on the popular will and the will of the people's representatives too. Now, why did they believe in sturdy institutions? Because of their culture, because of their background. Most people don't know what kind of education these people had. The colonists and the framer generation. These were people steeped in the Greek and Roman classics. If you wanted to study and if you wanted to rise in the professions, if you wanted to go to a college, you had to know the classics. You had to know Greek. Can you imagine yourselves being required to know Greek so that you can read the classics in the original language? They all knew the Bible inside out, even though many of them were deists rather than Anglicans or Baptists or Congregationalists. They all assumed a certain view of human nature. They were carrying in themselves, they embodied a classical and Christian tradition. That was their personality. And it's because they had that personality that they knew that we have to arm ourselves against ourselves. The thing we have to fear more than anything else is we ourselves. We have to be fearful of human beings. You can't trust them with too much power. So what can we do? Well, they came up with this brilliant constitution to arm yourself against your own bad temperament. They were afraid of themselves. And I started out by making the comment, I'm not at all sure that we know how we got to where we are today. Our universities these days, on the whole, might be viewed as Rousseauistic in what they teach about human nature. There's something wrong about teaching people that they need to restrain a lower nature. That's not the terminology in which professors on American campuses teach about human nature. They're not teaching understanding of the Greek and Roman classics. We have Greek and Roman buildings surrounding us in DC, but what that implies is not being discussed. So to make a long story short, what has happened, especially in the last 150 years or so in America, is that the kind of educational preparation that would make for constitutional literacy and constitutional temperament have steadily eroded. And you have coming out of the universities, and of course, this is reinforced by Hollywood, it's reinforced by the entertainment industry in general, an entirely different view as to what is required of us. Everybody knows the story about the woman who rushed up to Benjamin Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention and asked, so what have you accomplished? Is it going to be a monarchy or a republic or what? And the famous reply is, a republic if you can keep it. They knew that constitutionalism, American style, demanded a great deal of human beings. You could not expect them to be noble sorts. That's not human nature. So they built institutions that would at least make it possible for people who are better than average to exist within the system and perhaps have some influence. But when that baseline, as Bill calls it, simply is no longer there, then you get McKinley, you get Teddy Roosevelt, you get Wilson, you get sort of bullying types who never learned not to be like spoiled kids.
But let me ask you this, Klaus. I think that's a very insightful analysis, but it seems to me we confront this dilemma. You know, ideas that are prevalent typically follow power. Ideas ratify power. And I think the paradox is, as the franchise in the United States expanded very rapidly, it pushed the culture to a lower common denominator, if you will. The franchise was very restricted at the outset. And look at the presidents we got, you know, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams. And 28 and bringing in Jackson, that was really the first huge expansion of the franchise. And I don't know whether the human nature is sufficient when you push to the large majority of people, and it sounds, people will say, well, I'm an elitist or something, that they have the capacity to understand and eagerness to understand constitutional personality process and things of that sort. And that's where we are today. I certainly would not, given government by the consent of the government is the touchstone of our declaration, say someone should be denied the right to vote because they don't have, you know, an education like some others. But it's just the nature of ideas that become ascendant that follows power. And the more that power flows to just a large mass of the people, the more the ideas that are ascendant will not reach the level that we witnessed at the time of the framing.
Well, and where does the power lie? I would argue that the power lies ultimately, and this is something that Bill could speak to, it lies with the people who shape the mind and the imagination. If you want to know what's going to happen in the United States in, let's say, 30 years. Look at what is happening on the campuses. That is, these days, when you hear about what's taking place in so many of America's cities, some people are like deer in headlights. They say, where did this come from? There's absolutely no mystery about where this came from at all. It came from the campuses. It came from our culture. It came from Hollywood. It came from the publishing industry. And it's overwhelming American culture to such an extent that if you or I were to try to persuade American elites to make room for the constitutional personality, they would scorn you as a hopelessly outdated authoritarian elitist, and they would start talking about the need to liberate the people. They would talk in generally sentimental Rousseauistic terms. And when that is the state of American leadership, what else could happen to the Constitution than what is happening to it now?
Well, just to interject here, so we had, when we started the committee, when we had 9/11, and we really didn't have a national debate about 9/11. So Bush took us into Iraq, and my wife, we were having dinner parties, and I was sounding off, and she was kicking me under the table, and I was getting black and blue shins. And I told Bill Nissy, I said, Bill, Ann says I can't talk about the Iraq War, and he said, well, I think she's right. Maybe what we should do is start the Committee for the Republic, and Chaz and Boyd and Gray, and we started it, and we tried to get the people from both the Democratic and the Republican Party and Independents together to talk about what the parties weren't talking about. So the first we had 8 years of Bush, and then we had 8 years of Obama. I had half of our group when Obama got elected. Half of the left of center people came to me and said, well, gee, we can abolish the committee now that Obama's been elected. And Obama succeeded in inheriting 3 presidential wars from Bush, and then added 6 more and handed 9 to Trump, who so far has not added more, but has kept the presidential usurpation going for his term so far. So that was stage 1, and then when the timing just happened to be that way, we then went into stage 2, and we said, all right, in addition to the salons, we're going to go up and engage. We can't make America great again if we don't make Congress great again, and it's not a co-equal branch. They've got 18 enumerated powers. They've got all the powers. The president only has a few. And they have all the power, and so we've got to go up and engage with the senators and the congressmen. And so we came up. We got our board to agree on putting the 2 greatest powers of the 18, the war power and the impeachment power, together, and define a presidential war as a high crime and misdemeanor, and that's an impeachable offense. And we got Walter Jones to submit it in the last Congress, and then Tulsi Gabbard this one, but we just couldn't get any headway. And then when the Democrats won the House, we went up and tried to get the James Madison here, Bruce and I went up, and we tried to get the Jamie Raskin, the head of the Constitutional Subcommittee of the House Judiciary, to support it. He didn't. Then to have hearings, I was, very much, when I got out of Harvard, the only job I wanted was to work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because Fulbright had the Vietnam hearings, and so we wanted to have hearings, and it didn't have to be just on our solution, which is the constitutional. The best way to shut these wars down is we have all the power in the Constitution. All you have to do is exercise it. So let's have hearings and have people come in and talk about other ways to do it, cut the money off and so forth. So got nowhere. And so I reached the conclusion that I'm not going to waste any more time I wasn't part of the deal that got them there, is keeping them there, and it's a waste of time. So then stage 3 was, well, let's take an experiment here, and let's go back earlier in the retail end of the politics when the candidates are running. You got Democrat and Republican candidates, and we'll make James Madison here, Bruce, available. And we will, we designed constitutional literacy tests for Republican Democratic candidates. We tried that here in the 5th, which is the largest district in Virginia. It's larger than New Jersey. It's the largest in Virginia. It's Madison's 5th. And the experiment failed. And what we learned was it's too late. Once someone decides they want to run, and they're not running on, the 18 enumerated powers in Article 1 and their knowledge of that, and they're running for their own reasons, and they're not the ones that we care about. So I reached the conclusion that failed. But in the spirit of Thomas Edison, who said he never failed, he just found 2,000 things that didn't work. We're now in stage 4, and stage 4 is, well, the kids are the future by definition, and we're going into the Rappahannock High School and offering to teach a civics course. The civics course in Virginia that's taught in the 7th grade is pretty thin gruel, but at least they're teaching it. But they're not doing it. They're not really teaching general theory of man, separation of powers, all the stuff that you need to know. But we're going down that road, and so that in 2 years from now, if this works, we might be able to scale it. And the idea would be that when the next congressional election comes around in 2 years, the winner of the Constitutional Literacy Prize in the high school invites the Democratic and Republican candidate to come to Rappahannock High School to debate the Constitution. And they can't, you cannot take, you can win a Senate race, you can win a House race, you can win a presidential race, but you cannot take office unless you put your hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the Constitution. So we have 535 people in the Congress who are committing perjury. We have 2 in the White House who are committing perjury, and they're not doing what they're swearing to do. So I think it will be very difficult if we're able to do this. This experiment. I'm hopeful, but that's kind of where we've moved, and so I'm all for. When Claes and Bill talk about a constitutional personality and citizen identity, here. But I do think we're going to have to. It's got to start. We got to use competition, and we've got to use political competition. We've got to drive constitutional literacy. We have to start with civics in the much earlier than college.
I think you've got to start with people learning history.
Right.
More of our students, high school, way back, need history, not just American history, world history, to understand what they're doing, so they can start thinking. Crucial in education.
Right. This E.D. Hirsch has got this book on cultural literacy, where he makes the argument that basically there's certain things you have to know to be an American, right? If you grow up in France or you're Japanese, you have to know certain things to be Japanese. You have to know a different set of things to be French. And what you're saying is those are the things that. And what I was shocked is when I read his book, he's talking about cultural literacy, but he doesn't mention constitutional literacy. And our exceptionalism is constitutional exceptionalism. It's not our DNAs any better. Our exceptionalism is our constitutional exceptionalism. And that's where I think we're saying the same thing.
I think Diane Perlman had a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Anyway, I really appreciate your concepts very much, and the idea of an imperial personality as a psychological concept of a personality theory. I'm a clinical psychologist by background and also social science, interdisciplinary social scientist. So, that one, so I'd like some thoughts about it. One is that in terms of individual psychology, but it also, in terms of social psychology, that there's a system that allows for that personality, or that helps that personality develop, and that can function. You know, something like the Stanford Prison Experiment or the Milgram Obedience, that there are people around it. And then there are systems of domination and techniques of like psychological manipulation of the public and mystification. And I guess also maybe some nepotism, and maybe also inducing helplessness in the public, or a passivity or fear that they can look up to a leader and allow the leader to have that power that they couldn't otherwise. That's terror management theory. So anyway, there are a bunch of different concepts and theory levels of theory. So I'd like your thoughts about that.
I'd highly welcome actually a psychological portrait of the imperial personality by someone who really knew the field of psychology. I think that would be very interesting. I refer to the imperial personality more as kind of an outlook on politics. So let me give an anecdotal example. There's a national security official in the Obama administration named Michael McFaul, and he tweeted out the other day, Trump has lost the military, he's lost the State Department, and he's lost the intelligence community. How can he serve as commander-in-chief? So let's set aside, Trump for now. Let's just say he believes that the president of the United States is illegitimate because the people who run the empire believe he's illegitimate. And if the people who run the empire, who are unelected themselves, if they believe the president is illegitimate, then the president is illegitimate. This is the imperial personality. This is not the constitutional personality. This is somebody who views the entire world through the success of empire, not through the success of constitutional order. And that's sort of the way I view the imperial personality. It's an outlook on life. It's a way of viewing politics. It's a way of viewing other nations that wants to impose its will on others.
Okay.
But Bill, isn't it true that every nation that once it develops its capacity, it assumes the imperial personality? You don't have to worry about it when you have a little tiny ant. But as soon as the possibility of domination appears, then they become imperialist. China, when it didn't have the sinews, it wasn't rattling, over Taiwan or Tibet or the Uyghurs, but now, it's in the South China Sea, it's in the Philippines, and now claiming all sorts of things it didn't claim before, just like we did. I mean, it's no accident, I think, that we began to become, and if you want to say the imperial personality of Teddy Roosevelt, when our economic might and military resources made it feasible. I mean, at the time of the framing, you had 6 frigates, we're not going to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, as Quincy Adams said, because we couldn't, even if we wanted to.
Yep. No, I don't disagree with that. And the world's most successful and famous democracies, ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, the French revolutionaries, once they assumed power, they became imperialists. I tend to agree with that. But that doesn't mean that there can't be statesmen who are counterpoised to that.
Yeah, I don't think in the 66 empires in the last 3,000 years ahead of us, I don't think we can point to an example where a society walked back off the imperial plank. It's a car without a reverse. So it's all one of the things we're going to be doing, and we're going to be doing more of. We had one salon last year on our national debt. But basically, our largest manufacturing business and our biggest export business is fiat currency for foreign central banks. And we because we don't have political competition on empire, the two political parties don't compete on it. They don't talk about it. But we're running about $1.5 trillion off balance sheet enterprise. That how long is that going to go on? Now with the COVID spending is really accelerating the federal debt. Once the reserve currency goes, it's over. Pentagon shuts down, problem solved. So the when that's going to happen, it's going to happen, I believe. When it happens is no one can tell you, but so we're going to be focusing a lot more on reserve currency, the debt, how we really finance this thing. We could basically pay for all this military spending if we raised our tax rates to European levels. But any party that did that, either the Democratic or Republican Party, said that that's what we had to do. You know, no one would do it. So the only reason it exists is because they won't talk about it, right? Because and foreign people are financing our empire.
John?
So that is a line of inquiry that we're going to go down. Pat.
Well, I came on a little late, but I wanted to know, did we salute Steve Cohen? I saw in the Post today that Steve Cohen, who I think we had speak about a year and a half ago.
Yes, Steve died last month.
He died. I think we should salute him for the great work that he did for the Republic in his career.
Yeah, he was really quite extraordinary.
Then I want to ask Bill a question.
Yeah, I think we were his, the January Salon that we had for Stephen Cohen was the last public event he did in his lifetime. And we try to talk about Russia. We have a Salon on Israel every year, one on China, Russia. We try to do every year when the Trump won and the Hillary constructed this argument about the reason why Trump won was because Putin influenced the election, as opposed to the two parties that basically let the middle class down for the last 40 years. It's been flat, and you had a populist backlash with the Tea Party and then Trump. We couldn't have a Salon on Russia until the Mueller report came out, and so we wanted to, but we just couldn't. It was because it would because we're trying to bring Democrats and Republicans in, and unfortunately the Russia thing got very, very political. So we had to put that off. And Stephen did a great job, I thought, in opening that conversation up, given his background. Katrina being at that time the publisher of Nation magazine.
Yeah. Now, one more thing I wanted to ask Bill. I had the great good fortune in my career to work 15 years up there on the Senate Banking Committee. So and I follow politics, I'm active here in Virginia, but what I see is the role of money in our political system. Our elected representatives of the people spend half their time just raising money instead of other things they should be doing. And these moneyed interests have an inordinate influence on everything. The people's voices are drowned out by the money that comes into the whole system. So have you looked on that part of our problem here and helping the Republic recover from being captured?
No, I was a Hill staffer, and I saw what you saw. But you know, the only answer I can give to that is the reason there's so much money in politics is because the government is so big. Right. You know, if the government were small, you would have no money in politics. The government is in everybody's business. It's in everybody's. It regulates everything. It taxes everything. It's involved in everything, and that the people who are affected by the government want to influence it. And there would be if you hacked down the size of the federal government by 50%, and that includes the Pentagon, you'd have 50% less money in politics. That's just what I believe. The money doesn't come from nowhere. It comes because the government's so large.
And I don't see the Democratic and the Republican Party, Bill, do you, saying we're running 25% of the GDP through the federal government. That means we have a permanent campaign finance problem, right? Incurable. And that the solution is to cut the amount in half of the GDP we're running through the federal government. Obviously, don't want China. They run 100% through their government. They run everything for all intentional purposes. But I don't see the two parties debating that. Do you?
No, because it increases their power to have the government that size. Yeah. You know, everyone on the Armed Services Committee loves the Pentagon budget.
Remember, our biggest export is weapons. half the reason we were pushing stuff to Israel and all the countries over there, we want to sell more weapons and shoot each other to make money. Horrible.
But we began our imperial ambitions before the money problem is as acute as it is today, before we had 25%. Began, you know, with Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson when the influence of money was far less, but that did not at all dent, you know, this eagerness to rule the world for whatever they want to call it, democracy, bringing civilization everywhere at the head of the bayonet. It's not that money doesn't contribute to it, but the underlying evil in human nature is far deeper. And you'll find countries that are impoverished that still have imperial ambitions. You know, Eritrea fighting Ethiopia over clods of dirt. Neither of them have any money at all. Bill, you know, you hit on that, and that's really the intractable issue. I think that Pat's right. Money aggravates the situation, but you get rid of money, you're still going to have a real problem.
Yeah. Azerbaijan and Armenia are at each other's throats right now. They're not exactly.
One other thing I wanted to add that I see now is you have when I was a youngster and you get involved in political campaigns, people were volunteers and other. Now you have a whole industry of young people who go around from campaign to campaign and get paid, and they make everything, and they treat their opponents as enemies because they don't have to work with them. That's their job to get them elected. So it poisons the whole political system when I watch what's going on, even on individual candidates and the people around them now, because they all hire these youngsters who make money just doing that with their lives.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that the culture of the campaign world is such that it does not promote statesmanship. It does not promote constitutional personality. It promotes a certain kind of hack politician.
So people of virtue don't want to go into it anymore.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
We're going to be having speakers on the Democratic and Republican Party, how we got here. We're going to be analyzing the role of the parties in our constitutional deconstruction in future salons. So I'm not going to announce the speaker now. We've got
Also
a very interesting lineup.
Also, on that line, the two-party system promotes a kind of a dualistic black and white thinking, splitting us, them, all or nothing, and that you have to be, if you're in this group, you have to oppose the other group, and you have to believe everything this group. So there's a structural problem, pathology in the two-party system, I think.
Yeah, well, there's a groupthink.
Yeah.
Well, that's true, but it's not always been that way. And I think this hammers home Bill's point about the culture. You remember Thomas Jefferson's famous inaugural, you know, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. We may disagree on particular points, but we all agree on larger values. And that was at a time, as you well know, the Federalists were at loggerheads with the Republicans. The venom was great on the heels of the Sedition Act. And yet he still spoke of, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. It is impossible to conceive, you know, today, a president or a member of Congress saying, we're all Republicans, we're all Democrats. Forget it. It's because we've become much, much more tribal. And part of that is just a slow deterioration of the culture that becomes incrementally worse year by year, in part because there is no civic education anymore. It doesn't exist.
It's also fueled by like Fox and MSNBC and the cable news shows. They all demonize the other one, and they're all like completely threatening that if the other one wins, it's going to destroy the country. So everyone's getting it.
But throughout, in the midst of all that cynicism, there still are people that end up shining through it. You know, I mean, I greatly admire Tulsi Gabbard, for example, who has bucked all these trends and is not a grubby politician, has not engaged in the same, is magnanimous, bipartisan, open-minded. I mean, there are, you know, leaders can come through all this muck and rise above it, and we just need more of them.
Yeah. But I think that I think it's misplaced somewhat to blame the media, because the media is looking for audience ratings. They're out there to make money. If people didn't tune in, they'd change what they're broadcasting or what Limbaugh's doing. The reason why they pander is because that's what the audience wants, much to our horror. We don't like to accept that. We think they're being brainwashed, but no one forces anyone to turn on the TV or turn to a particular channel. It's a purely voluntary act. And we now have a culture that is so tribal at the individual granular level. Okay, the media just reflects what's out there in the marketplace. It's not the other way around. It is true, Tulsi is kind of like a mutant in the strain, in the species, if you will. You can count them on your hand with fingers left over, and they're admirable, but I don't think they can change by themselves the narrative. They're just overwhelmed.
John, we have a question from the chat. I don't know if you can see it. Bill, do you have ideas and recommendations on how to reduce the enormous divisions in our society?
Well, if I had the answer to that question, I think I'd be on Fox News and MSNBC. I don't, I don't want to be simplistic, but I think it's partly an educational problem. That John Henry referred to E.D. Hirsch earlier, and education used to be about content, transmitting certain pieces of information that are important and that are deemed important by the Republic, that people must have to be citizens. And that's all gone by the wayside. Educators now want to give kids critical thinking skills. They need to be critical thinkers. They need to have mental discipline. They need all these attributes that don't have content. And if you're not providing content to the young generation, and the content is not, you're not immersing the younger generation in the traditions and ideas, stirring their imagination with all the great heroic acts that have gone before, all the wonderful ideas that that they didn't learn about the Constitutional Convention, you're going to have a fractured society. People are going to believe in different symbols and different ideologies, and that's what we have now. And that's the product of an educational system that is not providing a coherent content and not transmitting to one generation to the next, our patrimony, our legacy.
Well, Bill, I think the time has come. I really want to congratulate you on the work you've done in this book, and I gather you've got another book coming out and I talked to James Madison about writing an essay for that.
I'd be honored, and I will say Tulsi Gabbard's going to write the foreword to my next book on U.S. foreign policy. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping the University of Michigan Press will give me the okay.
We'll keep it up, and thanks so much, because I think it's a real, what we talked about tonight is so fundamental. I might just say one thing. I think the reason why people the separation of powers comes from a general theory of man, and those general theory of man conversations just aren't taking place in the society. Historically, where they took place was in churches and religion, and now that we're a more secular society, there's really no space in the public square for general theory of man conversations. And I think that's why Rousseau has had so much he was able to be beaten back for as long as he was, because those conversations took place. I know that you are a serious Catholic, and you've Catholic Church invented the doctrine of original sin, and many people think it's the most sophisticated general theory of man there is. But congratulate you on making as Babbitt did, the connection between who we are, what our nature is, and the constitutional change that we need to tie ourselves down with to be have a thriving republic, and let us all march to our own drummer.
Thank you, John. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, and
Thank
thank
you.
you,
Thank you
Claes.
very much. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Bravo.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Good job. Thanks, John.
Good job, John.
Thanks.
Good job, Bill.
Thank you.
Right on.
Great, Bob.
Right on, right.
Thanks.
Right.